Somebody told me you wanted to learn about clean technologies. How convenient. This is exactly what I'm going to be talking about. So, clean technologies. Um, the definition of clean technology is products, services, or processes that reduce waste and require the minimum amount of renewable resources. So a big chunk of this presentation is actually about legislation and how manufacturers and governments are trying to solve some of these problems around sustainability and sustainable development. So things like drivers, the legislation, technologies that have been put into place, as well as solutions that they're actually trying to, the way they're trying to come up with solutions, the connection between manufacturers and governments. Okay? So, drivers, why would you want to do this? Number one driver promotes positive impacts, right, on the environment, on the world. Making sure that there's no negative impacts and natural conservation, reducing pollution, reducing waste, reducing energy, all of those other points as well too. But big one is promoting positive impacts. Impacts in reducing waste, impacts in reducing pollution. Okay, so that's why a manufacturer would want to have a clean technology. Legislations. So that's a big reason for it forces manufacturers to have to follow their process and clean up their manufacturing processes. There's lots of different legislations out there, lots of different conferences, global conferences that are created. We'll talk about a few. I'll show you some, and I actually want you to find some of your own. But legislation, laws are put into place to try to force companies to create or to clean up and have less environmental impact. And if they don't, they get fined or they can't even be shut down. So there are these conferences that I mentioned. There's numerous ones, but big ones are things like what they try to do: clean up waste, reduce carbon emissions, give funding for nations in need, try to balance out any challenges globally that people are having. And then there are certain guidelines that can happen as well too to create or to help sustainable development. And this is all done from a governmental level. So the UN does a lot of these, lots and lots of conferences, lots and lots of platforms to try to create sustainable development strategies. So a few big ones: Rio 1992, Kyoto 1997, Johannesburg 2002. Most of them were also rethinking economic development. How can we stop the destruction of natural resources, stopping pollution on the planet? And those were the kind of big points that some of these are trying to do. You've probably heard the Kyoto Protocol. I think it recently just came up when the not newly elected, but the current president of the United States tried to pull out of the Kyoto Protocol. Or actually, I think the U.S. might not actually have been in it. Sorry, I said it incorrectly. So these things are always coming up, always around. So here's a little bit more information about Rio and other things that have arisen from those conferences. Okay. So there, again, other certain systems and things that have happened. Social systems have put into place. Politics have tried to change. Different countries require different requirements. All these types of things are what happen inside of these conferences. Okay, so you can see what the different targets, how they change based on different countries. Peru 2014 was something that happened. Lots and lots of different ways to try to combat pollutants or environmental damage and promote sustainable development. Another big one was the Bellagio principles. These are guidelines that help sustainable development. You can click on this link and read every single one of them, but here's kind of outlining some of those big points. So it's for countries or it's for companies who want to be more sustainable. And really, here's summarizing a couple of those things, but just have a quick read. It's another way to assess the progress towards sustainable development. So not just a conference, but here's some tools that you can use to help your development. Okay, so there's a little bit more about it too. You could stop the video if you want and have a read through. Here's a question. I wonder if you can answer it. I don't think I'll put it on the form, but I wonder if you could try to answer the question to yourself. All right, good. One thing that's important for you to remember is that through these legislations and through these conferences, the UN and other types of governmental organizations really need to balance the requirements of different countries. Excuse me, Germany is going to have a very different requirement than a place like Nigeria. So these developed and developing countries are going to have different needs, different definitions, and different values. So it's important that it's tough to get a consensus, but it's important that these guidelines, these principles, these conferences can set up something and create something that's beneficial to everyone, okay? Developed or developing. So on the form, one thing I want you to do is I want you to find some type of international legislation, local legislation. It's up to you what it is that you want to find, but find something and try to briefly describe how it's contributing to sustainable development or how it's trying to reduce emissions, et cetera. Try to find some of those things, thinking at a governmental scale, okay? So, manufacturers and legislation. It's a tricky balance that they have to push and pull between the two, but it's important that they talk to each other because really the governments who are the ones who are imposing these laws, but the manufacturers are the ones who are implementing them. They're the ones that are doing the work. So they have to make changes. They have to there's a big difference for things that happen to them. The governments are the ones that say, hey, you guys got to do this. So it's important that they can balance these two things. Communication is huge. They need to listen to each other. All right? So they have very different perspectives on sustainability and understanding the time. Governments take a lot of time to make decisions. They have to get consensus. They have to talk to a lot of different people. It takes time for them to make a decision. Versus manufacturers can quickly make decisions because they don't have to wait for governments. Excuse me. So, but their objectives are also very different. Sometimes the government's objectives are about the well-being of the nation or the world, versus sometimes the company or the manufacturer's objectives are about money-making. So it's important that these two things are evaluated, considered. So just what are those differences, and then how, and they can be pressured or pushed or pulled in different directions. So it's just something that you need to recognize and be aware of as you're developing or you're creating these products and developing them sustainably. So 3 things that can be difficult for governments to impose some of these legislations. There's lots of things to balance. There's workers, there's environment, there's economic growth, there's all these different things. So it's hard for governments to make a decision. Lots of different people to try to talk with. They have to talk with the developing, the manufacturer. They need to make money. They need to talk with the developed, all these different things. And it's hard to do that, not only for economic reasons, but also just for different interests and different personal interests. And then it even comes down to logistics. So how do you map it? How do you chart it? How do you assess it? How do you control it? So there's lots and lots of stuff for governments to do to try to get to make these things in check. And they operate differently, so it just works differently. So this can happen legislatively with laws, with all types of regulations that can be put in. But there are certain little technologies that, in addition to the energy sources that we already talked about, that can be used to limit pollutants and wastes. So things like whole systems changes, end-of-pipe technologies, possible radical and incremental solutions, and then, well, what do these manufacturers think and what these manufacturers do with these changes? So I think I'm going to take a stop here, and I'm going to do the next one when we talk about these, but that first part was really about the legislation. It's important that you know the importance of those, okay? So remember in your notes, there is one question. I want you to find something, some type of legislative process, and please put it into, describe it, and put it into that form, all right? Thanks. See you soon.